Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. Unfortunately, the Gospel of Luke is placed among the Gospels in third place, before the Gospel of John, and thereby separated from the book of Acts. This is unfortunate because it is now easy to miss not only that Luke and Acts are by the same author, but also that they are two volumes in a series, not two independent books. At least to some extent they should be studied and interpreted together. Too often this is not done. Its placement also suggests that Luke's Gospel is just that, a Gospel, belonging to the same type of literature as the other three. But is it, seeing that Acts is not? And what exactly is a Gospel? And what is the book of Acts? These questions continue to be hotly debated, and for good reasons. To determine the genre or type of literature of a text is an important step to understanding it properly. An obvious example: a fairy tale is different from a newspaper article, most of the time anyway, and we read them in different ways with very different expectations. What makes or determines genre or type of literature? It is based on shared elements such as form, content, function, and purpose. From these derive rules or principles regarding how a text is to be received and interpreted. Until the early 20th century, the Gospels were generally understood as a kind of biography. Around the time the New Testament was written, biography was becoming an increasingly popular type of writing. Strictly speaking, we should refer to it as bios, the Greek word for life, since this was the term used back then. Bios dealt with the lives of special individuals. The Gospels do this too. From the 1920s onward, however, the consensus shifted dramatically. The Gospels were now understood as a unique type of early Christian writing. It could not be explained by comparing it to other types of literature of the ancient world. And this position became the standard view among New Testament scholars until recent decades. In other words, Gospel had become its own type of literature. Let me back this up with a quote from Larry Hurtado. Until the 1970s, there was practically a consensus that the Gospels constituted a unique literary genre in the Greco-Roman world, and that any apparent analogies with other early Christian writings or from the wider Greco-Roman literary setting were irrelevant. This consensus has been challenged, however, and various scholars have argued that the Gospels are related to one or more types of Greco-Roman literature, most often biographical writings. Of course, in some sense, everyone and every text is unique, but it seems fair to say that Jesus was uniquely unique. But does this make the Gospels a unique type of literature? Did the uniqueness of Jesus require and lead to an equally unique type of literature to capture his story? Probably not. In all likelihood, an ancient reader who would have picked up a copy of, say, Mark or John would have thought of it as some sort of biography. The tide has turned in recent decades. Many scholars now think of the Gospels as some form of ancient Greek biography or bios. They generally fit into this genre of ancient Greek biography. This view of the Gospel as a subset of ancient biography appears to be broadly accepted today. And one scholar who has contributed much to this turnaround is Richard Burridge, and in the Dictionary of New Testament Background he summarizes the case for the Gospels as ancient biography. And I'm going to quote quite extensively from this summary. Here we go. Unlike modern biographies, Greco-Roman lives do not cover a person's whole life in chronological sequence, and they have no psychological analysis of the subject's character. As regards content, they may begin with a brief mention of the hero's ancestry, family, city, his birth, and an occasional anecdote about his upbringing. Usually, the narrative moves rapidly on to his public debut later in life. Accounts of generals, politicians, or statesmen are more chronologically ordered, recounting their great deeds and virtues, while lives of philosophers, writers, or thinkers tend to be more anecdotal, arranged topically around collections of material to display their ideas and teachings. Often, the underlying aims of the author of the biographer may include apologetic, to defend the subject's memory against others' attacks, polemic, to attack his rivals, or didactic, to teach his followers about him. Many ancient biographies cover the subject's death in great detail, since here he reveals his true character, gives his definitive teaching, or does his greatest deed. Like other ancient biographies, the Gospels are continuous prose narratives of the length of a single scroll, composed of stories, anecdotes, sayings, and speeches. Their concentration on Jesus' public ministry from his baptism to death and on his teaching and great deeds is not very different from the content of other ancient biographies. Similarly, the amount of space given to the last week of Jesus' life, his death and the resurrection, reflects the space given to the subject's death and subsequent events in works by Plutarch, Tacitus, Nepos, and Philostratos. I hasten to add here that Larry Hurtado, whom I quoted earlier in this podcast, calls for caution here, and I think we do well to heed his call. He points out there are differences between the Gospels and Bios as well. The focus is not on the character of Jesus as a model to emulate, but on his unique role, and he is more than a moral example or an outstanding and admirable human. Besides, the purpose of the Gospels is different. They were not written for a general audience, but to serve the Christian community. A Gospel is meant as a basic text for when the church comes together to worship, not a text for private reading and enjoyment, at least originally. And so Hurtado strikes a sound balance by pointing out that both sides have legitimate points to make. The Gospels do share characteristics with ancient biography. We would expect the New Testament authors to have been influenced by general literary conventions and practices of their day. And yet, at the same time, the Gospels also exhibit a certain uniqueness, and thus, well, maybe the way to put it is they are a category or subgenre within ancient bios or biography. The evangelists, though influenced by their literary environment, produced works that in some ways were different and unique. So Larry Hurtado argues. And yet, as noted earlier, an ancient reader who picked up a copy of Mark would have looked at it as a form of biography in all likelihood. And we need to keep in mind that ancient biography was a flexible type of literature. It could be adjusted to a variety of aims, yet the resulting texts continued to show a certain family resemblance. And that is definitely true for the New Testament Gospels as a variety on this type of literature of biography as well. And now to the book of Acts, where the Gospels would have looked to ancient readers, broadly speaking, as something akin to bios. In the book of Acts they would have recognized the writing of history, or in one word, historiography. To be sure, as with the Gospels and bios, the genre does not fit perfectly. Luke's history writing is influenced by the Old Testament and Jewish history writing, such as that by Josephus, and it deals with an unusual subject where it still belongs in the general category of historiography. And this is where we are misled by the fact that Luke was split off from Acts and placed with the Gospels. Luke wrote it as part of a 2-volume work. Both parts serve the same aim and would normally belong to the same type of literature, in which case Luke's Gospel would primarily be historiography, not biography. The way Luke begins his Gospel supports this. In Luke 1, we'll look at it in a moment, he is explicit about what he is setting out to do, and it is not to write biography. Different from the other Gospels, his subject is not a person, but events, which suggests history and historiography. Let's read Luke chapter 1, the first few verses. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Let me pause here for a moment to point out that the word translated things here is the Greek term pragma, or in the genitive plural pragmaton, and it more often refers to events or deeds. So we have a narrative of events that have been accomplished. Sounds like historiography more than biography. Let me point out another thing. Things here as a word appears 3 times in the ESV. Each time it's linked with a very different word in the Greek. We have the plural of pragma in verse 1, then in verse 3 we simply have the word all, which calls for something to be added, in English, all things. And then verse 4, concerning the things, is concerning the words you have been taught. And then Luke goes on, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Now, admittedly, Luke's Gospel is mostly about a person, but Ben Witherington points out that history could include significant amounts of biographical material if it was thought, so Witherington, that a particular person was largely responsible for changing the course of history, like Alexander the Great, or Jesus of Nazareth. And who changed the course of history more than Jesus? By placing the Gospel of Luke into a different context, that of Acts, we open a new angle on its message. It implies that Luke goes a significant step beyond the other Gospels. He is not merely writing about an outstanding person, a uniquely unique individual, and what his life and his death mean for us. To put it in different words, Luke is not only writing theology, he is also writing history. Perhaps more than that, he is interpreting history, world history. In the events around Jesus, history has found its pivot and has its center. Acts shows how this had begun to impact the world. And so Luke offers a daring new explanation of world history, and at its center stand the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.